Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone to the session, MC12, What Outcomes Would Strengthen Multilateralism? My name is Deborah James, and I facilitate the global Our World is Not for Sale network of about 200 civil society organizations from the global North and South. And we are working together for the transformation of the global trade system into one that is democratic, socially just, and environmentally sustainable. And we include the gamut from trade unions, public interest organizations, and environmental groups, development advocates, you name it, civil society organizations. I would like to thank our co-organizers, HEBRIP from Brazil, the Tricontinental Center from Belgium, the East African Trade Union Confederation. If any of you are having trouble with audio and you are listening in English, sometimes if you turn off the interpretation, it should improve. I believe we will all be speaking in English today. We have an incredible panel today of distinguished speakers, ambassadors from around the world and leading civil society experts speaking specifically about what should be the outcome at the upcoming 12th ministerial meeting of the WTO. There's a lot on the table, and you will have the chance today to hear from some of the top negotiators in all of these areas about what should be the outcome this year. But I want to take a step back first. We are in a global crisis of the Holocaust of COVID-19. As of today, 234 million have fallen ill, and nearly 5 million people have perished. That includes nearly 1.5 million people in Latin America and the Caribbean, over 1 million people in Asia, nearly 500,000 in India alone, which is surely an undercount, and over 200,000 in Africa. And there will be potentially millions more. Right now, we have a recipe that can prevent approximately 95% of hospitalizations and deaths from COVID. And yet half the world does not have access to it. Now, of course, many of those people died before the vaccines had been invented or before they had been proven safe and effective, which obviously they are. But this is the issue. If the US, the EU, Switzerland, and Japan, and I'm talking about their negotiators in this institution, had agreed to the waiver on TRIPS when it was introduced by South Africa, India, and many others in October of last year, then production could have been ramped up within months, and we could be talking about distribution globally on a massive scale. Instead, we're talking about getting Africa to the vaccination rates of the developed world in 2023. So that means probably 1 million people are dead today who would have been alive if the waiver had been agreed. And there could well be another 1 million who will die before the rest of the world has enough vaccines. So 1 million people are dead so that a few billionaires in rich countries can become multi-billionaires, because the WTO protects the rights to profit from invented intellectual property over the right to life. The blood of those millions of people is on the hands of big pharma and their lobbyists, on political decision makers, and their representatives here in the WTO, because it's the WTO's rules that enforce this vaccine apartheid. To solve this problem, we are counting on negotiators in the WTO. But the WTO is an institution that sets rules on commerce, the agenda of which has been nearly completely driven by the interests of large transnational corporations. COVID is fundamentally a public health issue, but the plight of whether millions of people live or die should not be determined by commercial interests, but by public health experts. Negotiations should be over how best to ramp up production and distribution worldwide of diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines, not on whether billions of people on this earth will ever have access to them. And they should be taking place among global health experts and ministries, not trade ministries and corporations. This tragedy is the clearest example of the overreach of the WTO. We are not solving the pandemic because big pharmaceutical interests have too much power. And one of the mechanisms of their power is to have achieved the TRIPS agreement at the founding of the WTO in 1995 that should never really have been agreed. This is really the only issue that should be being dealt with in the WTO today. It should absolutely have priority over any other issue currently being negotiated. Instead, we hear that WTO resources are being illegally used to negotiate agendas among some members that were specifically blocked by a majority of members of the last ministerial, and in fact, which are subverting, resources that need to be used for mandated negotiations. Of course, I'm talking about the Joint Statement Initiatives, JSIs, or plurilaterals. The most important thing to know about the JSIs is that they are entirely corporate driven, that they are fundamentally about creating a mechanism by which foreign corporations can integrate themselves into the domestic policymaking process in developing countries, which they have no place in being, because the domestic policymaking process is inherently about balancing the interests of citizens in the public interest and should never be about satisfying the interests of foreign corporations. And I'm referring to what are euphemistically called the transparency mechanisms in domestic regulation, investment facilitation, and digital trade illegal non-mandated JSIs. Now I have some more to share from the perspective of civil society, but I would like now to introduce our very highly esteemed panel. We have 3 ambassadors with us. I think this might be one of the only panels here at the WTO Public Forum that counts on such a generous contribution of ambassadors to the panel. First, we will have Her Excellency Kolelwa Mulumbi-Peter, who is the ambassador and permanent representative of the Republic of South Africa to the WTO, one of the leaders, undisputedly, among developing countries and specifically of taking on the challenge of the waiver. We will also have His Excellency Brajendra Navnit, who is the ambassador and permanent representative of India to the WTO, another very similar leader, co-sponsor of the waiver initiative and many other important things in the WTO. We will also have His Excellency Muhammad Mujtaba Peracha, ambassador and permanent representative of Pakistan to the WTO. And these 3 will share their views as insiders leading the negotiations amongst developing countries for a pro-development outcome at MC12. And we are also very lucky today to count on the participation of Sonia Reed-Smith, who is a legal analyst and senior researcher with the Third World Network, which, as you know, is the premier advice and analysis civil society organization from developing countries here in Geneva. So I'll go ahead and stop there. And without further ado, I'd like to give Ambassador Kolelwa Mulumbi-Peter from South Africa the floor.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and thanks very much for organizing this session. I think this is a timely opportunity for us to share views about what should be outcomes at MC12 that will contribute to strengthening multilateralism, but also importantly, that will contribute to the developmental agenda. You have highlighted the context within which we are having MC12, which is an unprecedented crisis of our time. And our view is that we need to find a WTO response to the crisis that we are currently facing, and that it is urgent that we do so. A number of multilateral organizations have made a contribution, and it is important and timely for the WTO to do the same. And such an outcome must really unlock productive capacity and diversify manufacturing in developing countries beyond fill and finish. We do welcome the initiatives that are there, including cooperative mechanisms between the private sector, including COVAX. But I think what is clear to us after more than a year since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic is that all of those initiatives are not sufficient, and we need to have a TRIPS waiver that will address the IP-related barriers which are necessary for us to be able to unlock a productive capacity, but importantly, diversify a productive capacity. History shows us that an effective response to pandemics requires speed, because as you have a pandemic, you, of course, will have new products that are produced. However, also history shows us that it is difficult for companies to produce sufficient quantities within that speed, given the growing global demand of a pandemic. So when we put forward the TRIPS waiver proposal in October 2020, it was with that in mind. That yes, the vaccines were not there at that time, But it was clear to us, looking at the HIV pandemic, looking at other pandemics before it, that it is important that we have a cooperative mechanism and global solidarity, because that is what is required to deal with a pandemic of this magnitude. And for us, the obvious solution was to unlock all barriers to production, both trade barriers, but most importantly, IP barriers, and that sharing of technology and know-how is critical to ensure that we have timely, affordable, and equitable access to life-saving products. What also is important for us was to ensure that we use all policy tools that are available in the WTO toolbox. Waivers are within the framework of the WTO, and in exceptional circumstances, as outlined in Article 9 of the Marrakesh Agreement, members can take a decision to waive certain obligations to address those exceptional circumstances. For the co-sponsors, this was never about an ideological debate. It was about saving people's lives. And as far back as April, during the first meeting that the DG of the WTO convened with the pharmaceuticals companies, Minister Patel of South Africa proposed 5 elements that will be critical for us to respond effectively to the pandemic. He said we need to have a targeted, time-limited TRIPS waiver. We need to scale up production in different and additional parts of the world, including through the existing market-based mechanisms. We also need to deal with vaccine nationalism. And of course, we have been participating in the facilitator-led process, which is led by Ambassador Walker, to also look at other trade-related elements that would need to be addressed so that we avoid a vaccine nationalism. But we still feel strongly that dealing only with the trade-related aspects without addressing the IP-related aspects will not be a sufficient response to the pandemic. And I think it will also be important for the WTO to reaffirm the G20 principles that any measures that are adopted in the context of the pandemic should be temporary, targeted, proportionate. But what is important is that we need to be cautious of using this pandemic to come up with trade liberalization agenda or new disciplines that are outside of the WTO commitments. However, we are committed to work with all members to find mechanisms to address, as I said, all barriers that are necessary for us to unlock production. The fourth element that Minister Patel emphasized was the need to address transparency of contracts, but because what we have seen is that developing countries and LDCs end up paying much higher prices for the vaccines than developed countries. And already they are struggling to secure the vaccines because we see a high level of vaccine inequity when it comes to this. And of course, with the information asymmetry, especially for an institution that prides itself on transparency, we believe that it is an important aspect that as WTO members, we would need to find a way of tackling. Finally, the important aspect would be that as we look at responding to the current pandemic, it's also important to prepare for future pandemics. What that would mean is that we need to negotiate TRIPS provisions that will allow us to deal with future pandemics, and we avoid the need to have special arrangements and waivers in future. So it will be important to use this experience and also prepare for or negotiate trigger-ready rules that can be implemented should we have another pandemic. And we hope that it will not take years before the WTO is able to conclude that, because we don't know when another pandemic will come. So as we said, clearly, even though we hear that there is an increase in vaccines that are being produced, and there is also an indication that 11 to 12 billion doses will be produced by the end of the year. But it is also equally true that those vaccines are not readily available to the whole world, especially in Africa that still has less than 3% of people, adult population that has been vaccinated. We have also heard from the COVAX that they have had to cut the delivery target by 25% because of supply constraints. So the fact that we have an increase in production does not mean that the case for a TRIPS waiver has gone away. Actually, what it means is that it is actually even more important now because those doses are not able to get to people. But also importantly, we need to create resilience, especially in developing countries. And we listened quite carefully in the opening session of the public forum where the representative from the big pharma also recognized and emphasized the need for local production in developing countries. So the waiver is an important mechanism that will assist us to achieve that important objective. I want to emphasize that the waiver does not imply any change of the substantive treaty obligations. It only temporarily suspends certain IP provisions for a limited period to be agreed by members, and it is thus time-bound. It is targeted only to those aspects that are critical to the diagnosis, prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19. We are of the view that the ongoing vaccine inequity is both unjust and counterproductive, and that if we are to contribute as the WTO membership to saving people's lives, we need to send a strong message at MC12, and that message should be about global solidarity. It should be a message that recognizes the critical role of the WTO in assisting and contributing to common challenges that are facing the world. And there is no more important challenge than this current pandemic. So our view is that the TRIPS waiver is an integral part of any successful outcome at MC12. And we believe that if members sit around the table, we can and we are capable of finding a solution. Nelson Mandela is quoted by President Ramaphosa in the opening ceremony of the public forum, said, it seems impossible until it is done. So it is possible to deliver a TRIPS waiver that is balanced, that takes into account the interests of all. I must also add that as the TRIPS waiver co-sponsors, we have also said we welcome all the suggestions that can provide a solution, including the EU compulsory licensing proposal. Of course, it would require that we engage with a view to also enhance that proposal, which deals with different aspects of IP as well. So all contributions are welcome, and we would be ready to engage with all proposals so as to find a solution. Now, quickly turning to agriculture, which is again another critical issue of importance, not only to developing countries, but also all members of the WTO. And for us, the trade distorting domestic support is one of the issues that require reform in the WTO. And I think all members would agree to that. We also are of the view that we need to deal with a long-standing injustice in the area of cotton. The Cotton Four have put forward a number of proposals calling for reform. However, the WTO has not been able to deliver, and it is important, especially in the context of COVID-19, that we find a solution. What COVID-19 has led to is a rise in food insecurity, especially in developing countries. We believe a permanent solution for public stockholding is a necessity, and we must also find a solution towards the safeguard, special safeguard mechanism. We believe that given the limited time that we have before MC12, what members would need to work on is a package, meaningful but targeted package on agriculture that will deal with food security and protect the livelihoods of people. And such a package must also preserve the support to rural and agricultural development that is available under Article 6.2. Now, given the context, what is clear as well is that COVID-19 will have a disproportionate impact on developing countries. But what we also see is that when it comes to economic recovery, given the challenges that are faced by developing countries, and what we hear is the K recovery, which is uneven. What is important is to look at what role can the multilateral trading system play in supporting, especially developing countries, to recover from this pandemic. To us, that requires that we find an appropriate balance between national development strategies as well as multilateral cooperation, so that we address the multifaceted challenges that we all face, and also recognize that we are dealing with these challenges as common as they can be, but under different and specific contexts. So it will be important that we find a mechanism of acknowledging that. I said there is a disproportionate impact of the pandemic to developing countries. And what this calls for is continuation of a developmental agenda in the WTO. And that agenda must also preserve the multilateral character of the WTO. It must preserve the underpinning principles of the WTO in the form of a special and differential treatment, as well as a consensus decision-making. We are aware that, yes, we are dealing with the pandemic, but there have been other underlying challenges that are facing the multilateral trading system that require the need to be addressed. And one of those is a dysfunctional dispute settlement system. We always talk about the dysfunctionality of the WTO only in relation to the appellate body. But I think from a developmental perspective, the dysfunctionality of the WTO also extends to the inability of the WTO to deliver on mandated issues, especially multilaterally and properly mandated issues. This includes the Doha Development Round, because if we had addressed the Doha Development Round, developing countries would have had better tools to respond to the current pandemic. Now, coming to fisheries, we would want to have a successful outcome on fisheries negotiations. But I think as I conclude, it is important to ensure that such an outcome does not lock in the status quo and entrench the existing imbalances in WTO agreements. Effective and appropriate S&D must be part of the outcome, and countries that are not the cause of the state of the oceans should not have to bear the brunt of the disciplines. We believe that the negotiation and the outcome of the agreement must be based on common and differentiated responsibility. What that means is that the biggest subsidizers and distant water fishing nations must take the biggest responsibility. And we need to find an outcome that also safeguards food security and livelihoods of small and subsistence fisheries. And it is in this regard that we believe that the disciplines must be targeted at large scale industrial fishing that accounts for over 85% of the subsidies. Thanks, Deborah. Let me end there.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those amazing insights into what is actually happening in the negotiations right now. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to His Excellency Brajendra Navneet, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of India to the WTO. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Deborah, and good afternoon, co-panelists. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, friends who have joined through the virtual platform. I can see 71 participants. So I am a bit nervous that 70 people, more than 70 people are listening to us. We don't know who are listening to us. So first of all, let me start by saying that we are in a pandemic situation, and the pandemic has not gone. Whatever people say, it is going to continue for quite some time, and we need to learn to live with it, and we need to learn to find solutions how to live with it. So any world organization or multilateral organizations during this situation will, I think, without doubt, will have two priorities. One, that how to minimize loss of life and livelihood, and two, how to accelerate the economic recovery. And when I say economic recovery, I mean broad-based economic recovery across geography, across economies, and within economies also different sectors of different sections of society. It pains me to say that most of the multilateral institutions, They have tried their bit in last 12 to 18 months, and they have changed their stated stance. However, the organization for which we are working, the organization in which we are working, it has not changed a bit. It is not a matter of pride to say that the WTO has not changed even 1% of its stated stance, that whether a pandemic is prevailing or not. That means we, the diplomats here, are so much disconnected from the ground realities, what is happening in our own geographies, in our own countries. What we hear, the WTO response to pandemic, thanks that also a lot of persuasion to start that process after 12 months, maybe 15 months of pandemic, that there should be a WTO response to pandemic. Otherwise, we were pushing market access agenda in the name of trade and health. And what was there in the content? It was market access in the form of lowering or eliminating the tariff. It was market access in the name of removing export restrictions. It was market access in the name of more transparency. What was new on table in that proposal was only more and more collaborations with multilateral or different international organizations. So it is in this context we are sitting today. It shows a lot of frustration, but it still also gives some hope that even after 15 months, if WTO has started pondering over WTO response to pandemic, then maybe 15, 20 months, we may be there something to substantially contribute in the pandemic. And let me quote from what my friend Kolalwa had said, that till it is not done, that impossible. College days, we used to joke that impossible says, I am possible. So that gives hope that still it is doable, and we should not lose heart, and we should try to do something. Now, let me touch upon the priorities for India or for developing countries, including least developed countries, what we hear from our colleagues and what we hear back home in the country. The three items which Kolalwa has rightly explained. The first one is certainly on how to ramp up the manufacturing and equitable distribution of COVID-related products, whether it is vaccine, therapeutics, or diagnostics. The second one is on agriculture, because it is linked to food security as well as livelihood. And the third one is the most famous topic here in WTO, because it takes a lot of time for me to explain back home in capital that why are we discussing fish when we are hit by a pandemic. So going by the taste of the season, that yes, fish is very important. And since we have not done something for 20 years, so therefore we must show during pandemic that we are doing something for the world. And therefore we must conclude what was pending for 20 years. And the same applies to the proposal on table for World Food Program, because last 10 years, no country has imposed export restrictions on World Food Program, but just to show that multilateralism has delivered on food security. So therefore, just give that World Food Program a positive nod and say that WTO has done its bit and move on. So these are the three priorities for us. One, let me start with agriculture. Why we say PSH? It is not that we are asking for it for last so many years and therefore it should be given. Let me put things in perspective. During pandemic, countries who had public stock holding programs, they were able to control what you say, the deprivation due to non-availability and non-affordability of food. For you just take the example of India, for 8 or 9 months last year, and now during the second wave, we are providing food to 800 million people through this stock holding program. And you imagine that if these 800 million people are deprived of the food security, what will happen to the world parameters? And if due to want of food stock in India, if we start tapping the world food market, what will happen to the world food availability, and what will happen to the world food inflation? So therefore, brushing aside and giving economic theory taught in colleges and schools that some form of subsidies or some form of interventions are bad. Let us come into realism and see that what is delivering on ground. Let us not question that tool during a pandemic. We have again 10, 15 years to debate and discuss various contours of any program. But please accept this, that this tool or this design has delivered for more than 800 million people. And we are a country of more than 1.35 billion people. So therefore, don't question the design during a pandemic and deliver the PSH. Second point on PSH is we are against some sort of entitlement for certain number of countries. What we see in domestic support, that you have AMS entitlement for certain countries because they had the fiscal capacity to provide those subsidies in 1987 or 88 or whatever was the reference period. And those countries who were not having the capacity to do that are not having that entitlement, and therefore they cannot subsidize their farmers to that extent. We don't want this distortion in public stock holding, because the present thing is saying that what was notified in 2013 can do. So if one country has the capacity, administrative and fiscal capacity to run a public stock holding program, can continue to run under the peace clause, but you cannot bring in new programs and new products. So the second contour of public stock holding, what we are asking is to allow inclusion of new programs and new products so that whoever has the capacity to do that will be able to do. And whenever they will learn from peer countries based on their experience, they are allowed to do that. The third one is on the domestic support in the agriculture pillar. Again, Kolilwa has touched upon it, but I would request the participants to make up noise on that, because there are now submissions. Now gone are the days when developing countries were only seeking special and differential treatment and carve out. Now we are questioning the reverse special and differential treatment being enjoyed by these countries for so many years. And therefore, domestic support proposal from India, which is on the table, is a very important milestone for me particularly, because it is questioning the reverse special and differential treatment being enjoyed by rich and developed nations for so many years. And these supports are actually trade distorting and is a threat to livelihood of so many countries. On TRIPS, I will not add much because Kolilwa has explained it a lot. I will just bring it some economic perspective to why India says that it should be done quickly. You look at the loss of output, and you look at the kind of fiscal and monetary stimulus being pumped in by various economies in last 12 to 15 months. If you look at the stimulus alone, it is of the order of $15 trillion. $15 trillion. And most of these stimuluses are in the form of either debt or likely to be the future tax. So certainly someone is going to pay for that. And by spending $15 trillion, still economies are not very sure that what will happen next year. The second loss is the loss of output, that if you look at from the baseline scenario, how much of world GDP loss has taken place in calendar year 2020 and whatever we have seen in 2021 is of the order of not less than $6 to $7 trillion. So in $85 trillion world economy, we are talking of something of the order of adding both these two, $20 to $21 trillion. And what we are asking for is ensuring 5.5 billion adult population of the world into 2 doses, 11 billion doses. 11 billion doses, let us put some price to that, $5 or $10 a piece, something like that. We are talking of something of the order of 50 to 100 or even $150 billion. It is not comparable that one side countries are willing to spend $20, $21 trillion in the form of a stimulus and lost output. And on the other hand, we are so touchy and we are so possessive about providing $50 to $100 billion to some sectors and not allowing the things to move on. This doesn't make any economic sense. So for a moment, even if I remove that social responsibility or equity or efficiency or that kind of hat and just purely talk in the terms of economic return and economic argument, it doesn't make sense for any economist to support $20 trillion of loss of output and stimulus, and not allow $100 to $150 billion of products to be moved in quickly into the world market so that people can start their normal life. On fish, we are very clear that it is not the matter of only special and differential treatment. Again, for India, it is the matter of preserving the future policy space, because certainly we are not in that condition where we have led to this kind of problem. So therefore, those who have created this situation, they must respond and they must give the solution to this problem, and don't try to push their responsibility on those people who are still not having industrial fishing fleet. So therefore, our argument is have a look at our proposal in overfishing and overcapacity player, which has been submitted to WTO for negotiations, and that provides future policy space for developing and LDC countries. At the same time, it brings out, first time in the text format, the common but differentiated responsibility and polluter-based principles. So I will stop at that. Thank you. And I'm willing to take any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's really interesting whenever speaking with ambassadors from developing countries, we really hear about the impacts on people, on the fisher folk, on the agriculture workers, on people's right to food, on people's right to live. And it's really not so much about commercial interests like you might hear if you were in a panel with ambassadors, for example, from my country, the United States. So we're running short on time. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to His Excellency Mohammed Mujtaba Piracha, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the WTO. And can we have the video channel proper? Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and good afternoon to all joining us physically and virtually. Just telling Deborah of be passing a slip to the Indian ambassador of Pakistan, doing that is very sensitive. So in many bilaterals that we've had as co-sponsors, one of the things that I've sort of pointed out at times to other diplomats is that the importance of this, and I link it to multilateralism, the importance of having India and Pakistan on the same platform when we are there on a number of issues in a multilateral. I think that's the beauty of multilateralism. Despite our many differences, because of our such similar contexts and issues, it would be unnatural not to be asking for the same things of the international community. The importance of multilateralism too is not unknown to, especially to developing and smaller countries, poorer countries, because it gives a platform, and especially in an organization which is rules-based, gives greater opportunities to be heard, which is important, opportunities to make coalitions, which obviously carry a lot of weight. Numbers carry weight in multilateral organizations. The issues, the agendas can be issues-based, and there's a possibility that in bilateral interactions, it always runs the risk of being primarily political, while here we can discuss issues rather than bilateral politics. So it becomes very important that multilateralism is strengthened, not just at WTO, but in other multilateral institutions. And I think after Kulelwa and Brajendra, it's very hard to add anything when it comes to the TRIPS waiver debate ongoing. But I will say this, that it is a problem of the global commons. And in absence of a global government, the best thing you have, the only thing you have is multilateralism, multilateral action. And if this does not kick in to solve the problem, then going forward to the challenges of the 21st century, primarily climate change, is going to be very hard to address. And there, you can't really do JSIs. You have to involve the poorer nations, the nations without technologies, the nations who cannot afford to do it alone. So the lessons that a global commons problem and its solution will provide to us today would go a long way in helping humanity fight the real issues that face us. So I can come back to that. One of the points that I'd like to make is that when you talk about the global commons and you talk about in game theoretic terms, issues of global commons cannot be resolved through a competitive outlook. Cooperation in game theoretic terms is the only way you can reach an optimal outcome for all parties concerned. So the big question is that, is WTO really the forum which is tuned for trade competitive dialogue? Is it really a forum to address issues of the global commons? So that is a question that poses itself to the WTO going into the 21st century. If it is going to be an effective multilateral organization, it is going to have to learn to work in a cooperative way rather than primarily competitive fashion. So there is also a matrix that I might share, maybe if I have time later on, if technology allows, but perhaps I'm told not. So just covering up, taking a step back and going back and quoting from the Marrakesh Agreement that people signed on, hoping that trade will raise the standards of living, ensure full employment, growing incomes, and would care for the environment and its resources. If it can do all that, and I quote from the agreement, recognizing, it says, recognizing further there is need for positive efforts designed to ensure that developing countries, and especially the least developed among them, secure a share in the growth in international trade commensurate with the needs of their economic development. And development, as pointed out earlier, has been one missing element when it comes to negotiating committees, when it comes to regular committees at the WTO. There are views that for the WTO staying relevant, indeed, it risks irrelevance when it does when it does not fulfill its objectives, and when it ignores the mandate of development. But the WTO can get back on track by delivering on the development agenda, which has been on the table for many years. For instance, in fisheries negotiations, it would be a gross mistake, and to make the same mistakes of the Uruguay round and reaffirm the imbalance built in the agriculture agreement, as Prajendra has pointed out. We cannot have developed countries continue their subsidies to fishing activities by greening them and stop developing countries from building their capacities. Similarly, the original imbalance in agriculture would need to be addressed if we wish to find a more developmental approach. The need for food security and livelihoods must be the focus of development efforts in agriculture and fisheries. At a broader level, and I've mentioned this earlier, the 21st century challenges, heightened in particular by the pandemic, demand a global response from international organizations such as the one we're sitting in today. And TRIPS is, I think, the key. I think one aspect that WTO holds the key to fighting this pandemic is it's in its rules, in its regulations, is the TRIPS waiver. Everybody else in the multilateral world are doing what they can. The WHO, the World Bank, the IMF. It is up to the WTO to prove whether it can really come up with the missing sort of gap within the global response to the pandemic. So in terms of time, I'd just like to sort of conclude by reasserting the fact that cooperation and not competition when it comes to the global commons is the way forward. And that is something we need to strive for if multilateralism is to perform for everybody involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And if there's any technical people from the WTO, could you please get on it and fix the video feed? That would be marvelous for the rest of our session. So I'm going to turn to, after those amazing statements and insights from inside the WTO, we're going to turn back to civil society. And I'm going to mention that this week, 206 major civil society organizations, including global union federations, development advocates, women's groups, consumer organizations, and environmental groups, representing literally millions of people from more than 170 countries, delivered a statement, Turnaround, New Multilateral Trade Rules for People-Centered Shared Prosperity and Sustainable Development. This is really one of the most comprehensive and detailed trade policy statements ever from such a large group of organizations. And it was coordinated by Our World Is Not for Sale, and it's available in English, French, and Spanish. And I believe that the links are being put into the chat. So in the statement, we actually call for a new vision for multilateralism, really to replace the WTO, which is necessary in order to create the jobs, infrastructure, and services that are essential to achieve the sustainable development goals and safeguard our planet. But it also calls for transformational changes to existing rules while a fundamentally new institution is envisioned. That is because WTO rules too often limit government's ability to use traditional development policies, which were used by all industrialized countries in their own development to promote jobs and domestic industries. So in addition to reinforcing the demands for an immediate non-watered down TRIPS waiver, the turnaround details many existing harmful rules in the WTO that must be transformed so that countries can use evidence-based development policies to ensure domestic food security, to utilize technology transfer and data rights, to make use of job creating performance requirements such as local content and local labor requirements, and to have more flexibility to ensure affordable access to medicines among urgent priorities. And it must be stated that our ambassadors here have stated very diplomatically that they are calling on the WTO to offer a solution, a contribution to resolving the pandemic. But we're really talking about a waiver on existing harmful rules. We just need the WTO to get the heck out of the way, to get the TRIPS rules abrogated so that countries can start having access to those recipes and producing for themselves. So the statement also calls for an immediate halt to efforts to expand the scope and coverage of existing harmful rules. And in particular, our governments must halt the effort by big tech corporations to use the WTO to gain new pro-corporate rights in the digital economy through the inappropriately named e-commerce negotiations, and to bring more disciplines on investment policies through the quote unquote investment facilitation talks, and to further encroach on regulatory sovereignty through the quote domestic regulation negotiations, and obviously to stop the efforts to limit development flexibilities in the fisheries subsidies, as was discussed. So these are a minimum number of immediate changes that must be made in the multilateral trade system to provide more policy space for all countries to implement solutions towards promoting shared prosperity for all. That is the real multilateralism that is needed, a new system of international multilateral trade rules. But if we can't get that, we at least need the current bad rules to be peeled back and to stop the cancer from metastasizing by expanding into new agreements. So I have copies of this turnaround here in all three, in English, French, and Spanish. But without further ado, as an introduction to civil society, I'd like now to pass the floor to Sonia Reed-Smith, the senior researcher and legal advisor from the Third World Network, to offer further detailed perspectives from civil society. Sonia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you for including me in this panel. I just wanted to look back briefly at how the Doha round started in the WTO in 2001 and where we are now in terms of the impact on multilateralism. So, of course, the Doha round has not ended. We are still in the Doha round. It has to be legally ended, and it has not been ended. And it was supposed to be a development round. It was the Doha Development Agenda. And that included, in 2001, legal mandates that all WTO members agreed to, including on special and differential treatment provisions, to review them with a view to strengthening them, making them more effective, and so on. But 20 years later, this has still not yet been agreed. Instead, what we see is some developed countries trying to change the multilaterally agreed definition of which countries are developing to say, oh, the following countries are not developing. So they're trying to undermine that existing multilateral agreement. The second thing the Doha Agenda included in 2001 was to negotiate implementation issues, and that these could even be an early harvest. And implementation issues are things like having another transition period so that developing countries could require manufacturers, say, of cars to use local inputs like steel and tires, the way that developed countries did before the WTO began. This too has not yet been agreed 20 years later, even though it could have been an early harvest. Instead, we had an early harvest on trade facilitation, which was a Singapore issue that many developing countries opposed. A third issue that there was a legal mandate to that all WTO members agreed in 2001 was to address cotton ambitiously and expeditiously. Sorry, this was more than 15 years ago, not in the Doha one, but more than 15 years ago in 2004. And yet there is still no agreement at the WTO to restrict the huge cotton subsidies by developed countries like the United States, which are undermining the livelihoods of cotton farmers in developing countries and least developed countries, especially in West Africa. So these are three examples of legal mandates multilaterally agreed by all WTO members more than a decade ago, and yet which have still not been agreed. Furthermore, as you've heard a lot about, there is a shortage of vaccines and medicines to deal with COVID, and that there's this proposed waiver of intellectual property rights on some of these COVID products, such as vaccines, medicines, and test kits. So there's more production because 1.3% of people in low-income countries have been fully vaccinated compared to 59% in high-income countries. And these waivers are a legal flexibility built into the WTO rules in 1995, part of the multilateral trade system that developed countries like the European Union and Switzerland have frequently asked for and been given in WTO General Council meetings, including during this pandemic and including after the proposal of the COVID TRIPS waiver. So WTO members have given waivers to the EU and Switzerland since the COVID TRIPS waiver was proposed, and yet the COVID TRIPS waiver has not yet been agreed, despite 107 countries now supporting it. It is still being blocked by developed countries such as the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland. If the COVID TRIPS waiver could be agreed in next week's WTO General Council meeting, this would show that the WTO is able to respond to pandemics and that the multilateral trade system is still functioning. Then, of course, there are at least 9 current plurilateral negotiations occurring in the WTO which have no legal mandate. So this is plurilateralism gone wild and illegally. And there will be a session tomorrow at 10 a.m. Swiss time in the WTO Public Forum, session 75, which will explain how there is no legal mandate for these 9 plurilaterals. These include restrictions on the ability to regulate services, where they just concluded the text and they only released the text once it was all agreed, and it's too late to change it. The second one is investment facilitation. Thirdly, micro, small and medium enterprises. Fourthly, gender. There's 4 plurilaterals on the environment, and there's also the plurilateral on e-commerce. None of these have a legal mandate. And this, remember, is supposed to be a development round, where least developed countries are not supposed to have to cut their tariffs or liberalize their services. But in these proposed plurilateral e-commerce negotiations that have no legal mandate, the proposals are that all the countries participating, including the least developed countries, must remove tariffs on information technology products by joining the optional information technology agreements and liberalize all the sectors all the modes in some service sectors like retail and advertising. So this would require, if agreed to, all participants to allow as much alcohol advertising, advertising of prescription medicines, advertising of weapons, advertising of tobacco as the companies want, even though 182 countries have joined the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which requires them to ban tobacco advertising. The plurilateral e-commerce proposals also include TRIPS Plus protection of trade secrets, even though all WTO members have agreed to give least developed countries another transition period before they have to do any substantive intellectual property protection, including trade secrets, until 2034. So this multilaterally agreed flexibility for least developed countries is again undermined by the illegal plurilateral proposals in the e-commerce negotiations. These plurilateral e-commerce negotiations have many other implications, including restricting the ability to regulate of at least 13 different ministries in your countries and other regulators. Then, of course, the multilateral trading system has a legal mandate that all WTO members agreed to in agriculture to negotiate public food stockholding on a priority basis. It was supposed to be agreed by the end of 2015, still has not been agreed. And you've heard how public food stockholding can be helpful in a pandemic, as well as normally. And I think there will be links put in the chat so that you can hear some of the other public forum sessions on this. And the same for fisheries subsidies, where the current negotiations to restrict them don't have enough exceptions for fisherfolk in developing countries and least developed countries. So as some developing countries have said, these 20th century issues like public food stockholding, cotton, special and differential treatment, implementation issues so they can do manufacturing, these are very important and still have not been addressed at the WTO, even though they have a multilateral legal mandate agreed to by all WTO members, and these provisions like special and differential treatment and so on would help them recover from this COVID pandemic. Meanwhile, some developed countries want to move on to 21st century issues that have no legal mandate in plurilaterals that undermine the multilateral agreements, for example, the TRIPS transition periods for least developed countries. I think they're putting in the chat links to other useful analyses, for example, of the Walker process. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. We just have a couple of minutes, and I just want to take a moment to highlight some of the other sessions where you can hear some more about these issues. As Sonia mentioned, there is going to be a deep dive into the illegality of the joint statement initiatives that was mentioned tomorrow morning at 10. There is also going to be a really important session on data and looking beyond outdated notions on data flows, unfortunately scheduled also tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And then an important session also on gender, trade, and development, examining old and new issues in the global trading system. So I think you've heard quite a bit now from some really key people with a wide variety and depth of knowledge about what the current issues are. And I just want to address one thing that we haven't talked about that much, which is the digital trade negotiations. And, you know, I do come from the United States, and I'm very aware of the fact that these negotiations started when the lawyers and lobbies of Google and Amazon and Facebook gave proposals to the US trade representative. Actually, they just put their head lobbyist in the US trade representative's office. He was hired by Obama to start these rules. And then they worked through their colleagues in trade lobbies around the world, the tech lobbies. So you can imagine the Business Europe one is also dominated by Google Europe. And they started coming up with these proposals. And now you hear a lot about, well, the e-commerce is booming. We have to have rules on digital trade. We don't. The cotton industry has been around for millennia, and we don't have the rules we need on the cotton industry. Europe has been producing agriculture for millennia, and we don't have the disciplines that we need on agriculture. There is a lot more at stake that affects millions and billions of people around the world than ensuring free flow of data rights for multinational corporations, which should not even be on the agenda at the WTO, as Sonia has highlighted, because they are actually illegal negotiations. So I don't know if any of our ambassadors want to make any final statement, but you're okay, because it's 5:29 and I think they're going to cut us off. So I'd like to actually thank our co-sponsors for organizing this event, and please, if you will join us in thanking these ambassadors and Sonia for their time. They had trade negotiations today that they came out of to share their insights with you as to the importance of what is happening. This is a really crucial time in WTO history. It is becoming less and less legitimate, not just because it can't deliver on new negotiations, but because it is in the way of governments resolving the pandemic. It is in the way of governments resolving food security in their countries. It is in the way of governments being able to foster new innovation and development domestically through industrialization policies. And we need that transformational change. And we hope that all of you listening today will support these countries in their calls for changes to existing WTO and for positive outcomes at the upcoming MC12, if it is indeed to occur. So thank you very much to all of you and to our panelists. And we have copies of the statement here for any of you who might be interested, and it's posted in the chat. Thank you very much.